Hello and welcome to the March webinar from the IEA Clean Coal Centre. My name is Stephen Mills and I'm a Senior Analyst and Author at the CEN. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports which are available from our website at www.iea-coal.org. After a one-off registration, residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organisations can download our reports free of charge. Please visit our website for details. Now, during today's webinar, if you have any questions, please use the Ask a Question box. Please add your email address in case we run out of time or a more detailed reply would be more appropriate afterwards. Now we come to today's webinar, and we'll be talking about some of the wastes that are created during the production of coal. Mining has a long history, and over the years, in most coal-producing countries, huge quantities of waste have been produced, depending on its form, dumped mainly in large heaps or settling ponds. These are often highly visible and take up large areas of land that could be put to much better use. As we'll hear a little later, they can also have serious environmental consequences that can impact well beyond their immediate locality. This photograph shows a fairly typical example of a waste dump, one of the many to be found in the USA in this case. But here, notice how close it is to the houses at the bottom. I'm sure at times living in that close must make life quite difficult for local residents. Now, when we come to waste, what exactly are we talking about? Well, these can take a number of forms, but within the context of this report, I've concentrated on these three. There are history or legacy dumps of material from earlier coal mining and cleaning. There are various streams coming from coal washers from today's production, and there are wastes from current uses such as mill rejects from power plants, for instance. Now, in the past, all of these have been dumped, and in some cases they still are. The amounts deposited vary widely between different countries and depend on a range of factors such as the type of coal being mined, the particular mining techniques, and the effectiveness of any coal cleaning processes applied. Despite the best efforts of the coal sector in some parts of the world to reduce the level of waste produced, large quantities continue to be generated and added to the world's already enormous stockpile. Now, most people would agree that in a lot of cases it would be much better for these waste repositories to be removed and the land restored and put back to some useful purpose. Why would anyone want to bother cleaning up these when there's a good chance it's going to be quite complicated and expensive? Well, anything that can be done to reduce the impacts of coal production and use is to be welcomed, and this includes removal of these highly visible and often highly polluting reminders of coal's past, as well as those, of course, associated with current production. Now, usefully, many older wastes still contain significant amounts of coal that was lost during handling and processing, and if, as part of the overall process of restoration, this can be recovered and used as a fuel, well, so. Now, in terms of reducing coal's impact in general, as its biggest market, a major target has long been the power generation sector. To reduce coal's impact over the last few decades, a suite of technologies have been developed and put into use that are capable of greatly reducing emissions from coal-fired power plants. Many of these are focused on reducing emissions after combustion, and these systems have been very successful in reducing pollutant species such as SO2, NOx, particulates, and more recently mercury. However, the impacts of coal use can also be reduced near the beginning of the supply chain. For example, by using more selective mining systems that are capable of reducing the amount of unwanted materials removed along with the coal, and the use of more advanced coal washing techniques used downstream to remove much of it. Now, clearly, efforts like this can help reduce the amounts of waste produced from today's coal production, but we mustn't forget the huge quantities of stockpile waste from earlier years. Now, the problem of what to do with dumped and stockpiled coal waste isn't a new one. This has been an inherent feature of coal production since commercial mining first began. In many cases, the creation of dumps has been unavoidable, as getting coal out of the ground inevitably generates varying amounts of overburden, out-of-seam rock, unwanted materials and minerals, and mine drainage debris. Now, for a long time, in many countries, the environmental impacts of mining were largely ignored and wastes were simply dumped, often without treatment, in any convenient location. Later, as coal washing technology was developed and introduced, further waste streams were generated, and these in turn led to the creation of large storage and settling ponds containing various mixtures of fine coal assorted minerals in water. In most heavily mined regions, both dumps and ponds have had major impacts on local landscape and environment, and in fact many do continue to do so to this day. However, actions to address issues of visual blight and other environmental effects are not necessarily straightforward. For instance, as well as the often considerable costs involved, it may be difficult to work out who actually owns a particular dump or who's responsible for it. In some cases, these have been abandoned for so long that the mining companies responsible for their creation have long since disappeared. In other cases, even when a company or its successor is still operating, some have been unwilling or simply unable to accept responsibility for historical waste dumps. They simply don't have the resources to deal with the problem. So is the amount of waste being produced by coal production increasing or decreasing? Well, the short answer is it depends where you are in the world. On the one hand, coal production has fallen significantly in some of the more developed economies, although the amounts being used in many Asian countries have risen in recent years. In some cases, they're still rising and look set to continue doing so. Now, although coal use has fallen in some countries, such as here in the UK, in others, it continues to provide a reliable, cost-effective source of energy. But on the other hand, a growing proportion of today's coal production is now being washed. It's a well-known fact that power plants tend to respond well to the use of cleaner, better quality coal. This shows itself as improved efficiency, reduced operational problems, reduced maintenance, and lower emissions. Now, in order to meet today's tighter customer specifications and requirement for cleaner coal, more washing capacity is being added in order to cope with the greater requirement. Of course, more washing capacity inevitably means the generation of more wastes. Now, to address this growing need, new capacity is built in major coal-using countries such as China, Russia, Turkey, and India, and so on. Now, in some countries, deposits of better-grade coals have been exhausted. This means that lower grades are now being mined, and they require more intense washing to arrive at a suitable end product. Exhaustion of better grades also means that in some situations, coal that was previously used unwashed now requires treatment. For example, for many years, the USA has seen a gradual reduction in coal quality and a significant increase in the use of lower quality sources. And irrespective of the changes taking place within the US power sector in the future, some of these are quite likely to require more intensive cleaning prior to use. So to sum up, the generation of coal-related waste is decreasing in some countries, but it's tending to increase in others. Now, when it comes to waste, just to give you an idea of what can be involved, here are a few examples from some major coal producers. We'll start with the USA. After a couple of centuries of mining activity, government estimates suggest that there are around 46,000 abandoned mining sites just on public lands alone, and many of these include waste coal piles or ponds of considerable size. In Pennsylvania, where mining began in 1800, an estimated 16 gigatons of anthracite and bituminous coal has been mined, and this has created more than 5,000 abandoned, unreclaimed mining sites covering no less than 75,000 hectares. This includes around 840 waste coal piles that on their own occupy 3,500 hectares. Needless to say, the cost of cleaning up these sites is substantial. Estimates of a few years ago suggested it could be more than $16 billion. Of course, the USA isn't alone, and such problems are replicated in other coal-producing countries. And here are some numbers from some other ones. In the case of washery waste, although estimates vary, perhaps 60 to 70 gigatons have so far been deposited around the world in heaps and slurry ponds, although in truth the actual amount could be much higher. Now, what's often not generally realised is that at least some of this waste still contains a significant amount of residual coal. Older coal washing systems were often quite inefficient, which meant that a lot of fine coal was lost and dumped along with the unwanted minerals. But although many modern washeries can now catch a lot more of this coal, some is still lost and dumped with the waste streams. So both old deposits and some newer ones can still contain a reasonable amount of coal, and this clearly gives them potential as a source of energy. There can be strong economic and environmental cases for reprocessing some waste in order to retrieve this residual coal. Not only does this help minimise what would otherwise be an environmental problem, it also generates an income stream through the sale of the coal recovered. Cleaning up both recent and older dumps to recover coal in this way can sometimes be quite complicated and expensive, so income from coal sales can be used to help pay for remediating and restoring the site. And this type of arrangement has been used in a number of countries. But of course, it's not always straightforward. For a start, not all dumped material will contain enough coal to make its recovery economically viable. As we've mentioned, modern washeries have got a lot better at trapping much of the coal that was previously lost, so there might simply not be enough left. In other situations, dumped wastes may have been diluted or mixed with other materials, in which case they might have been too heavily diluted or contaminated to make coal recovery a practical proposition. But of course, where enough coal remains, and the particular set of circumstances work out, it can be a practical proposition to recover this to provide a low-cost source of energy. Now let's look at some of the reasons it might encourage coal recovery in this way. Well, these are essentially twofold and are mainly environmental or economic, or possibly combinations of the two. Recovered coal can form an inexpensive source of energy, and by using it, it's likely that the amount of fresh coal that would otherwise have to be mined can be reduced. This can clearly save money by reducing mining requirements, but simply you don't have to dig up as much fresh coal with all that entails. And of course, there are also environmental aspects to consider. Many repositories are pretty ugly, and particularly in the case of above-ground dumps, prolonged leaching can release various metallic species, and acid drainage can pollute watercourses. Furthermore, waste dumps don't easily support plant growth, so they're often unstable and prone to collapse. Yet another issue results from the residual carbon that many contain. This makes them prone to spontaneous combustion, and there are many instances where dumps have ignited and smouldered for long periods, releasing large volumes of smoke and more toxic emissions. Fires can burn for a long time and be difficult to put out. These are a regular problem in many coal-producing regions. In China, for instance, nearly a third of the country's 3,000 waste dumps have experienced spontaneous combustion at some point. And when these do ignite, the amounts of airborne pollution resulting can be considerable. For example, in South Africa, there have been instances where SO2 emissions from burning dumps have even exceeded those coming from local coal-fired power plants. So what else can have an impact? Well, there are clearly economic factors that can come into play. When it comes to clearing a dump, there are a number of possible options, although of course not all will necessarily include the recovery of coal. But if there's enough left in a particular deposit, it can significantly improve the possibility of site cleanup. We've already touched on the fact that the costs associated with the mining of fresh coal are avoided, but using recovered coal can also be useful in other ways. For example, well, as we said, it can clearly reduce the demand for freshly mined coal. Its use can help stabilize electricity prices and diversify the national energy mix, and it can extend the lifetime of other fossil fuel reserves, all positive points. Production costs are likely to be considerably lower than those of freshly mined coal. Of course, there may also be legislation that comes into play. Using waste rather than fresh coal can avoid certain taxes, and in some places, the disposal of residues is now strictly regulated. In some countries, using waste as a fuel has been actively encouraged, often with a view to minimising environmental impacts by having less of it to dispose of. For example, in Australia, New South Wales has introduced a levy on the dumping of washery rejects. Waste facility operators now pay a levy on each tonne of rejects received in landfill. The main aim is to improve the environmental management of coal waste by making disposal more expensive. And in fact, China has also recently introduced something similar. Now, although the use of can be productive in a number of ways, there are also challenges that must be met. We've touched on a few of these already. Mining and processing waste can be a significant energy resource, but as their makeup can vary widely, each possible deposit needs to be assessed on an individual basis. Each project will need to consider the quantity and chemical makeup of the particular waste deposit, as well as the logistics of coal recovery, treatment, and transport to an end user. But perhaps the biggest and most obvious factor is just how much carbon is present. It might be that the carbon level is simply too low to make the process economically viable. A further issue is that many wastes may have been mixed in dumps with other materials, as we've mentioned, diluting the overall coal content to the extent that it's just not worth reprocessing it. But simply, it'll cost more to recover the coal than it's worth. In some cases, the CV of the material might be too low, meaning it will need to be put through a reprocessing stage in order to boost it to an adequate level. This can involve different forms of mechanical separation, gravity separation, or possibly techniques such as froth flotation followed by drying. Of course, it's entirely possible that this could increase costs to the point where coal's recovery no longer is cost effective. And there may also be issues on the environmental front. We've touched on some of these, but there can also be a tendency for certain noxious species to accumulate in wastes, pushing up levels above those of the parent coals. So, some wastes have been found to contain much higher levels of arsenic, mercury, chromium, lead and sulfur. And of course, this all needs to be factored into any reprocessing planned. Now, a factor we haven't really mentioned much is the growing use of high-output, high-mechanized forms of deep mining. These aim to achieve high production rates, but by their very nature can be less selective, meaning that the coal can be quite heavily contaminated with unwanted rock and clay. And of course, this has to be removed by the washery. Similarly, the widespread use of open cast mining can result in coal output contaminated with overburdened clays and rocks. Although this form of mining is effective at producing large amounts of coal quickly, again, it can be less selective, and of course, this can affect the quality of the end product. In fact, the greater use of highly mechanized open cast mining has been flagged up as a major factor in the overall decline in coal quality experienced in some major coal-producing countries, such as India. Generally, with both forms of mining, to produce coal with characteristics that are suitable for power plants, it's becoming increasingly necessary to wash greater amounts of coal prior to use. Now, in a typical washery, perhaps 20 to 30% of the material fed in will be separated out during processing. This will mainly be unwanted minerals, but it's also going to include some fine coal. Now, the amounts of fine coal lost can be surprisingly high. For example, in the USA alone, this could be somewhere between 70 to 90 million tonnes a year, or roughly equivalent to around 10% of the country's saleable coal production. The situation is much the same in other countries. Now, globally, well, again, no one's entirely sure of the total amount of waste coming from washeries, and estimates vary widely, with figures falling somewhere between perhaps 500 million tonnes and a gigaton each year. Compared to older washeries, modern state-of-the-art systems can now greatly reduce the amount of coal lost during operation. This is clearly a positive development, but it also means that more recently dumped material may no longer contain enough residual coal to warrant recovery. But of course, not all washeries are state-of-the-art, and there are many older units still operating around the world that continue to lose significant amounts of coal. Waste streams from these can still hold potential for energy production. Now, a lot of coal wastes are already used in many of the world's major coal-producing countries, and some plan to increase these amounts. In some, they form an important source of energy. For example, China has nearly 33 gigawatts of power plants that currently fire coal waste in some form, and there's another 9 gigawatt under construction, and even more in the planning stage. Coal wastes are also used in power plants in countries such as the USA, India, Vietnam, South Africa, France, Spain, Turkey, Russia, and Indonesia. In most of these, governments and other national bodies have actively encouraged and promoted their greater use. Now, waste can be used successfully in a number of different combustion systems, although clearly there can be limits. But having said that, their use has attractions for power plant operators keen to capitalize on what can be a readily available, low-cost source of fuel. There may be potentially huge amounts stockpiled right on their doorsteps, meaning that for some, there's a guaranteed supply that will last for many decades. So just what are the technologies used to burn coal waste? As we've mentioned, largely because of technical constraints, the use of coal waste in PCC plants is relatively limited, but there are, I beg your pardon, let me start that one again. The most common form of system found is pulverized coal combustion, or PCC. Plants rely on several forms of this technology, and these dominate the global power sector. Most rely on coal as their primary fuel, although there are some that also use various coal waste, sometimes blended with other materials. A major problem is that the often high ash content of many coal wastes makes them difficult to burn directly in most PCC plants. In fact, technical constraints make some forms effectively impossible to burn. Some are particularly difficult to pulverize, and their high ash content can cause problems of slagging and fouling in the boiler, for example. However, under the appropriate conditions, using the right technology, some types can be used. Most PCC plants use fuel feed that comprises of coal milled to a fine consistency, and usefully, some finer residues from washeries or recovered from settling ponds can be quite close in terms of particle size, so may require very little preparation before use. Recovered fines from both sources can often be simply blended into a power plant's coal feed and fired along with the fresh coal. So which of the countries that are using the main users of coal waste in this way? Now, as we've just mentioned, largely because of technical constraints, the use of coal waste in PCC plants is relatively limited, but there are a few in a few places. At the moment, China is the biggest user. And as well as plants currently in operation, there are also others in development or being built. These are mainly of 350 and 600 megawatts and are a combination of sub and supercritical units. But there are also several ultra-supercritical units that are due to come online this year. A number of units already in operation use various wastes either as their primary fuel or as a secondary fuel blended with fresh coal. As well as China, there are also a few plants elsewhere that fire waste. For example, in France, there's one that burns fine-grained washery waste as well as coal water slurry. And there are also several PCC plants elsewhere, such as Russia, that fire anthracite washery fines or other waste, sometimes along with fresh coal. And of course, residual coal is also recovered from older dump material. For example, in South Africa, some of the country's many discard piles are being reprocessed in order to recover their coal content. And again, this is sometimes blended with fresh coal and fed to local power plants. There's a huge amount of this material stockpiled in the country, so potentially it could form a significant resource for the future. Now, coal gasification is the starting point for producing chemicals, gaseous and liquid fuels. Usefully, some coal mining and washery waste are also suitable for using gasification-based systems, and their potential has been studied in most major coal-producing countries. However, depending on the type of gasifier, as with other technologies, for economic or technical reasons, not everything will be suitable. Realistically, it's got to contain enough carbon and manageable levels of ash. But there are some commercial scale plants in operation or being developed that convert waste into liquid and gaseous fuels. In this respect, once again, China is the biggest user. As we've heard, the country has accumulated a lot of waste, and its gasification is being actively promoted by government agencies. So far, major projects have included, well, the one on the left, the ZZ plant in Shandong province, for instance. This ran between 2008 and 2015 and supplied syngas to a methanol facility. The design fuel was a high ash, 40% middlings from coal washing operations, although sources with more than 55% ash were also used successfully. And there are also these two other projects underway, as well as work in Poland and South Africa looking into the possibility of gasifying washery wastes. This brings us to fluidized bed combustion systems, by far the biggest user of coal wastes. Essentially, there are two main variants. Firstly, there's what's usually termed bubbling fluidized bed combustion, or BFBC. This technology is used widely for small-scale industrial applications, often using low-grade fuels with a low CV. There's a lot of units operating in India, for example, where, for more than a decade, use of the technology has increased steadily. The Indian manufacturer Thermax has supplied more than 250 of these units that fire different types of high-ash fuels, such as coal washery and mill rejects. BHEL of India also manufactures them, and there are around 100 or so in use. These routinely fire washery waste with an ash content of 55% and even up to 70% or more, with CVs between 7 and 10.5 megajoules a kilogram. Some waste are fired on their own, whereas others are blended with other materials, such as run-of-mine coal or petcoke. Now, the second and arguably more important form of FBC technology is CFBC. This is the dominant technology for using coal waste. Recent years have seen the technology become well established and plants are used widely. They now represent nearly 10% of the global power plant capacity. A major factor in the technology's success has been its fuel flexibility. Modern CFB boilers are often capable of firing, either together or separately, several fuels with different characteristics. This allows the use of the most economic fuel combination, or clearly, once again, there are limits. Operational experience has confirmed that when suitably designed, CFBC units can fire fuels with a CV ranging from as low as 4.5 megajoules right up to 32 megajoules, with moisture contents up to 60%, sulfur content up to 8%, and ash content of up to 65%, as found with some types of coal waste, of course. CFBCs are used widely for steam raising, power generation, and cogeneration, and are especially suited to using various coal wastes. Assuming that a CFB power plant is located close to a suitable source, such as shown here, it can form an inexpensive resource of considerable scale. Now, in the USA, some US mining states are dotted with large coal waste dumps, and for several decades, some of these have been reprocessed to provide fuel for a number of CFBC power and cogen plants. Most are in Pennsylvania, which has 18 grid-connected waste-burning plants, with a further 13 that use coal waste as secondary fuel. Recovery is usually carried out by initially on-site screening the waste to separate coal particles from contaminants such as rocks, then possibly followed by various recovery or upgrading techniques such as froth flotation, for instance. As you can see, the characteristics of waste coal can vary widely, but over the past decade or so, more than 200 million tonnes from both historical dumps and current operations have been burned. Now, moving on to China. Coal production waste make up the largest solid waste discharge by Chinese industry. In fact, it makes up around a quarter of the country's total. China has the most CFBC plants that fire coal waste, and more units are planned or under construction. All existing units are subcritical and generally fire fuels with a CV of between 6 and 13 megajoules a kilogram, although some waste used can be as low as 3.5. Using waste for power generation remains the government's preferred strategy, as it provides tangible economic and environmental benefits as sites are rehabilitated, but it also contributes towards meeting the country's growing energy demand. And finally, India. Well, India has a number of FBC plants that regularly use coal waste and washery rejects. Most are quite small. They're all subcritical units, with many operating as captive power plants supplying steam and electricity to various industrial sectors. CFBC technology has been in operation in India for more than 3 decades, and it's often used in conjunction with coal washerers. Now, as we've heard, not all waste deposits will contain enough residual coal to warrant its recovery. But where recovery is being considered, practical issues will need to be taken into account. So a dump or deposit must be large enough to guarantee a steady supply to an end user for at least a decade or ideally longer. And by way of example, this is the 105 megawatt Culver Power Plant A. This uses an Elstrom CFB boiler that fires recovered coal. As well as a cost-effective fuel, its use in this way has helped reduce the size of many local dumps and greatly reduce acidic runoff. Now, as each waste-fired power project is essentially unique, the economics need assessing on an individual basis. But to be viable and cost-effective, these are some of the things that would need to be considered. Now, just to wrap things up, well, today we've been talking mainly about 3 sources of coal-derived waste. Firstly, there's been historical waste, large dumps of material mainly from older mining in production. Secondly, we've heard about what are sometimes referred to as current arisings, and these are mainly materials coming from today's coal washing operations. And thirdly, mill rejects from power plant milling operations, which we haven't really had time to go into much today. As we've heard, there's often a tendency to focus on what's being done after coal is burnt in power plants, but we have to remember that things can also be done at the beginning of the production use chain. So it's important to try and reduce environmental impacts right through the chain, and this is where coal cleaning, allied with the productive use of rejects, can play an important part. But what things are currently encouraging the clearance of waste dumps in ponds and the recovery of residual coal from them? Well, around the world there's growing environmental pressure for the clean-up of many historical sites, as well as for reducing the amount of waste coming from today's coal production. As we heard earlier, both sources can have significant environmental impacts. Clearing waste dumps can free up large areas of valuable land suitable for agriculture or increasingly commercial development. There are many instances now where spreading urbanisation has meant that former mine and dump sites now occupied land that once cleared can be of considerable value. In land-starved countries, growing population means that the land has become increasingly important for agricultural purposes or housing. These are all good reasons, but ideally, where wastes are reprocessed, wherever possible, it should include the recovery of residual coal and its use as an inexpensive source of energy. And of course, this can provide a useful income stream that can contribute towards site restoration. So to close, where the circumstances allow on both economic and environmental grounds, using coal waste to produce energy can essentially be a win-win situation. Thank you. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you very much for your attention. If anyone has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. We'll see here. There's one question here. What progress has been made with upgrading coal waste, e.g. into pellets? Well, this is definitely done in several countries. Mostly we're talking here about material from older dumps that's been recovered and upgraded. There is certainly some work underway pelletizing, both on an R&D scale and also some commercial applications. So yes, it is being done, and advances are being made. We have another question here. You mentioned that coal waste can be combined with other materials. Is there anywhere that blends it with biomass? Yes, I did come across some examples where this happens. We mentioned the power plant in France, I think, on one occasion. It burns combinations of waste coal and several types of biomass. There are also CFBC plants in Spain, India and China that fire coal recovered from waste dumps, along with washery waste and wood waste in particular. It's also done in the USA, where there are several CFBC power plants that fire waste coal, but I think up to about 20% biomass. We have one more question. It's you mentioned that coal washing capacity was being added. Where is this happening? Well, this is happening in a number of coal-producing countries. Sometimes it's in response to the need for more coal, mainly for power plants, of course, and other times it's because more coal output is, I think, as I mentioned, is having to be washed, usually in order to reduce its ash content and boost its CV. So there's new capacity being added in many countries. For example, Turkey's building new washerers. In this case, it forms part of the government's plan to increase the use of Turkish coal and reduce the country's dependence on imported energy. In some other countries, new capacity is being built to deal with the fact that coal quality is getting worse, so more is having to be washed, so it'll meet power plant specifications. That's happening in India, for instance. In the case of India, there are a lot of new washeries planned, and the eventual aim is for all coal production to be washed, although I imagine that will be some time, considerable time off. But in the case of Coal India Limited, for instance, they've been developing at least 20 new washery projects, and I think another 25 or so are under consideration. And there are also new washery projects underway in Russia and China, for instance. So realistically, there's quite a lot around the world. Well, that seems to be the end of the questions. Thank you very much again for your attention. I hope that's answered all of them. The next Clean Coal Centre webinar will be on Wednesday, the 18th of April, when Paul Barua will talk about his recent report entitled Production and Supply Chain Costs of Coal. Once again, thank you for your attention, and goodbye from the Clean Coal Centre.